From a distance, it looks like one of those cute European cities tucked neatly into a bowl-shaped valley, surrounded by rolling hills and forming the perfect backdrop. It is, in fact, one of the oldest capitals in Africa, whose buildings date back to the early 20th century, at the time of the Italian occupation. And everywhere, the influence of the colonial master is evident. From the architecture to the names on the front of buildings, everything from pizzerias to cafes, from cinemas to side shops, Asmara could be mistaken for Florence or Naples or Tuscany, but with a distinctively African flavor. Now you'd be forgiven for thinking this is a typical street in a typical European city. Wide boulevards, tree-lined streets, sidewalk cafes, apartments above cafes. This feels a lot like Europe. The only difference is, it isn't. This is Asmara. If you think the influence of outsiders was coincidental, think again. Eritrea is one of those African countries where it seemed everyone was determined to grab a piece. First, it was the Turks under the Ottoman Empire, determined to make the port of Massawa a stopover in its quest to conquer the East. Then came the Egyptians, because Eritrea controls more than 1,000 kilometers of the Red Sea coastline, which spills over into the Mediterranean Sea with access to the vitally and strategic important Suez Canal. The third occupier was Italy, under the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who saw Eritrea as part of his expansion into a greater Africa. This was cut short after the Second World War, when Italy's defeat also meant the loss of her empire. Britain took over Eritrea after the war, and it would run it for a couple of decades before handing it over to Ethiopia, then under Emperor Haile Selassie, who would administer it as an extension of his own empire. The Eritreans eventually said enough was enough in 1961 and declared war on their southern neighbor. It was almost like a David and Goliath situation. Tiny Eritrea taking on mighty Ethiopia, backed by the even mightier West and East. Anywhere else, it would have been considered suicidal to go up against such a formidable foe. But not with the Eritreans, who would persevere against three different yet equally brutal regimes: Haile Selassie, followed by Mengistu Haile Mariam, and then the current one, run by Meles Zenawi. 30 years later, the Ethiopians were eventually humiliated into defeat, and Eritreans got their long and hard-fought independence.
Independence is something to celebrate every year, no matter what the situation is. Independence, hard-won independence by a nation that was completely neglected by the international community. That particular incident itself is something to celebrate every year.
And even though many here may be poor and lacking some of the freedoms that other Africans have and enjoy, most seem grateful for what they have and know that nationhood, like freedom, does not happen overnight and comes at a heavy price.
As I said, independence came at a very, very hard cost. Yeah. And we're continuing. I mean, every country after independence faces certain problems, and those problems are mended along the way. So why would they die in vain? I mean, here is an independent Eritrea, and its future is pretty bright as far as I can see.
In the meantime, the capital of less than 300,000 continues to reflect the will of the people, moving at its own pace, in no hurry to make the mistakes of other African capitals which have sprung up too fast, too soon, and mostly without a sense of forward planning. The question is, how much longer can this city retain its quaint outward appearance in today's rapidly moving race to modernize? Who knows what the answer is? But sometimes it is refreshing to see a modern African capital literally marching to the beat of its own drum. Jeff Koinange, K24, Asmara, Eritrea.